This podcast contains adult content and discussions of first-time sexual experiences. Listener discretion is advised. Some stories may include themes that are sensitive or triggering for some audiences. We talk a lot about first times. But what about being on the other side of it? Welcome to Sexual Encounters, the very first time. The podcast where we talk about first times for better, worse, and everything in between. I'm Mary Jane, and today we're exploring the other side of firsts. What happens when you're the more experienced one, guiding someone else through their very first time? It's a side of the story we don't often hear. The nerves, the tenderness, the awkward surprises, or even the pressure that comes from being someone's first. Sometimes it's sweet, sometimes overwhelming, and sometimes not at all what you expected. First times are often remembered from the perspective of the person having that first time. But what about the person guiding them through it? That role comes with its own mix of pressure, expectations, and sometimes even guilt or confusion. So joining us today to help us unpack what it means to be on the other side of firsts is Dr. Markie Twist. If you've been following our show, you already know today's guest. She's practically family here now. Dr. Maki has been with us on several episodes, dropping wisdom, laughter, and a little sparkle every single time. She's an award-winning sexologist, therapist, author, and all-round pioneer in the world of sexual health and relationships. And today, she's back to help us unpack what it means to be on the other side of firsts and what it feels like to be the one guiding someone else's first sexual encounter. Welcome to the show, Dr. Maki. It's an honor to have you back.
It is an absolute honor to be here. Thank you so much. I'm so enjoying the podcast. I can hardly wait to have this conversation with you, and hopefully the listeners will glean useful and meaningful information. So I'm just honored. Thank you.
So, Dr. Maki, why is it important to also center the other perspective, the person guiding someone through their first time, rather than make it all about the virgin and assume that because the other party has done it before, it should be easy, that they already know what to do, and that the responsibility is on them to make the virgin comfortable?
This is definitely one of those perspectives that people have. Like there's all this expectation already because someone in the dynamic is having their sexual debut. And the other person, in a way, is just more experienced with the act in general. But having said that, it's always important to be sure, of course, that sex is consensual and checking in on the comfort of all participants, right? So balancing not only the person who's coming in to the experience with less experience and the person who is more experienced, that you want to check in on consent and comfort for all parties and not default to just assuming comfort on either side right out of the gate. The other thing I want to just highlight is in this context, I'll primarily be focusing on adults, right? So people that are 18 and over. And I say that because a lot of times there are age gap dynamics in first time experiences in adulthood. And so it's important that we just ground the conversation there. That's not to say that someone can't be more experienced at 17 and have a first encounter with someone who's, say, 16. But it is often more the case if we're going to talk about, kind of this bigger gap, which often happens in terms of more experienced and less experienced, to consider it in adult context primarily. The other thing I'll note there too is because of that, there's this gender dynamic that happens, right? Because not only is there this societal assumption that, cisgender heterosexual men, just men, they often are the ones that have more experience, is the assumption. And particularly in adulthood, they are often the people that have had sex before their cisgender heterosexual female counterparts, for example. But here's the thing, I always wonder, like, who were they having sex with then? Like, that's always been a curiosity to me. Like, I guess, I mean, who was it if not someone who's the same age? But it often is not. It's often that some older, young adult man has had sex and a young adult woman has not. And so you also have gender dynamics. And so in terms of this particular example, again, I wouldn't just assume comfort right out of the gate. In terms of like the specific kind of myth of this, the person with the experience in the sexual activity should know everything and basically be able to guide and teach this person with less experience. Well, if we get back to this idea first, it's kind of first for all parties involved. Because even if you've had sexual experiences with other people, that's not the same person that you're having that experience with right now. And so that's a first for two parties, three parties, however many parties. So I think it's really important to think about what does that mean for the people in terms of their curiosity and the experience, regardless of what they bring to it, consent and comfort. And that really needs to be tied to the dynamics of the people and not assumed. Again, as oftentimes experience is tied to age gaps in adulthood, it's important to focus on, kind of two situations here. The person who, like you've already noted, who often has the more experience and frequently then is older. But also you do have to think about the person who comes in with less experience and is, coming from a place of not only do I have less experience with sexual health and sexual activity, but I have less experience just as a human. And so those dynamics, which as we get into this, I have a feeling we'll end up talking about power because it's related to a lot of this. Those dynamics definitely have to be considered. And I think definitely the person who has more experience, it isn't necessarily that you have to know everything or that you have to be a teacher or that you have to be perfectly comfortable or make that other person perfectly comfortable. But it does mean all parties involved have to be aware of those inherent dynamics that are often built in.
So, what kinds of emotions, pressures, or responsibilities can actually come up for that partner who's the more experienced one?
I love this question so much, Mary Jane. And I often am telling people, well, I freely am the kind of person who shares my experience in hopes that it portrays some of the things that people have questions about. And so this actually, part of the reason I love this question, I've had this experience. So when I was in, my early-ish 20s, I connected with someone in Louisiana where I was working on my master's degree in family therapy and my emphasis in sex therapy. And I formed a very close relationship with someone in a spiritual way. I was doing a lot of spiritual exploration at the time, a lot of Buddhist and Zen Buddhist in particular exploration. And this person was a part of that community. And it was an age gap. So I haven't even kind of told you guys, it wasn't just an age gap, it was an experience gap. So when we talk about adult age gaps, that's defined in the research as somewhere between 5 and 10 years. The researchers sort of land on 7 years because that seems to be where the kind of generational difference starts to take place. So 5 years might be too early, and 10 years definitely is enough time for there to have been a generational difference in some ways and a life experience difference. And so we were hanging out in the same community of people studying different practices, Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. This is when I first started taking up yogic practice in the community as well. And I was 23 and he was 19. Now, that isn't technically an age gap, but at 19 and 23, that's an age gap. Because think about the differences, right? I appreciate your reaction. Yeah. Because the differences, right? Even in Louisiana, for example, I was a bartender there at one time. and a server. And at 18 in Louisiana, with parent or guardian consent, you can legally drink in a bar with them, for example. But everywhere else in the country, you can't. And regardless, 19 to 23, tons has happened. Like that's just one example, right? There's other changes that have happened. And in addition to that, he had never had a sexual debut. And so we became very close friends first. He initiated in the sense that asked me out as, kind of more than friends. And I will say this, if you are the more experienced person, particularly if there's an age gap, it's important to let the person with less power inherently have the control. Like they're the person that I would say default to, because taking a position you're already power over. You already have more experience and power. It's just built in. And so it's really important to take a one down and really acknowledge that power, and then share it. I mean, so more of power over, it's empowering and power with. And this was my first experience in that, in all those ways, sexually with somebody that had never had a debut, an age gap like that. Because I mean, I hadn't been in adulthood very long either. And I'd never really dated people that were significantly older than me. So what that meant was the pressure was there, but I was so close to the person. It was already this empowering position. And they ultimately had the say in the voice that what we landed on spiritually for a first was actually Tantra. And so we went through a very step-by-step spiritual practice around Tantra. And so what that did was create a first for both of us, because I had not experienced that either. And so again, it spiritually matched who we were as people. It was loving, it was comfortable and consensual. It was led ultimately by the person that had less experience and inherently less power. And it really led to what I would consider to be, I definitely knew I had responsibility going into that, like the whole thing. And I believe it really, if you are going to operate in that way, which I would recommend in these dynamics, I think that there should be feeling, and there should be a feeling of responsibility, not necessarily pressure, but responsibility is a really appropriate feeling to have, because that's a combination of what I would consider care ethics, sexual health ethics, and consent ethics. And so I think that is probably the position to take, is a feeling of responsibility about it. And I think just reflecting on that first time experience, I mean, I don't want to speak for him, but we're still very good friends. And we still have really positive, wonderful things to say about each other in our time together. And I guess it's led to a feeling of being proud of that experience for all parties. But I don't know how it would have went, right? If I hadn't operated or thought about it with the care ethics I did. And here's the thing, there's no education on this, y'all. And so that's why podcasts and conversations like this are so important, because you don't learn these things. No one talks to you about it, at least not in this dominant society, where it's between het cis primarily partners. Like we especially don't talk about it in these more, it is just a stereotype pop culture kind of a one-liner joke in a lot of films. And that's all we learn. And that's not really ultimately helpful. So once again, I know I blame education a lot, but I'm going to blame it again. There we are. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Maki, for sharing your story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate, how you explain the fact that the person who's more experienced, it's recommended to kind of take the responsibility of leading. I suppose it also requires for the inexperienced person to also communicate this, right? Because, for instance, in my case, I never really communicated it. So you kind of assume that the experienced partner knows that you're a virgin, but maybe they don't know, and then they and then they're not as gentle or, as comforting about it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, if people had even more education, even within their families, right? There are families, particularly in multi-partnered families, where there are like first and second and third wives or husbands, for example, or even in intergenerational families where there's a story of someone who had more experience having a partner who didn't. and there's a lesson around it that's helpful. But if you don't have that, I don't even know if the person with more experience thinks to ask or have these conversations. And really, again, I'm going to say it's kind of their responsibility to do that. I think it's actually a little not as safe or wise for the younger partner to always be like, oh, this is who I am and I have no experience. And this is, exactly how old well, I mean, of course, age matters, particularly as we're talking about adults, right? But this is why, like, just in my own experiences, and I've now we've done whole research on this. I have a team of colleagues, which I'm happy to share that resource too, where we all are, well into adulthood, 30s, 40s, and we're all clinicians and we've all had experiences in our life with adult age gaps. And that's kind of how it's been. And in that experience and in finding themes around it from our own experience and the research, what little there's hardly nothing, by the way. There's just no one talks about these dynamics. What I kind of came to realize is when younger people have interest and less experienced adult people have interest in me and other people that have more experience, it really falls on the more experienced person to bring up these kinds of dynamics. And there are ways to do that, that are ethical. Like I I do a game of it often, groups of people, friends, regardless of who the people are, because what eventually happens is at some point they get curious about, like my age or generation. And so I'll say, okay, cool, let's play a game. It goes like this, and anybody can use this, please. It's a super helpful tool. We each get to ask 3 questions. It doesn't matter how many people are involved, and you can just do this at a coffee shop anywhere, right? When it comes up. And in those 3 questions, whatever you ask, you have to answer first. The answers that people give cannot be an exact year, and it cannot be an exact like age, and you can't look anything up. So you can't like cheat and like Google something. And, Gemini's not going to give you your life answer anyway, as much as people wish it would. So if we all consent to do this, and then we each take a turn. And then at the end of the 3 questions for each person, and everyone asks and answers, then we guess the year the person was born. And it's a really helpful tool because in a lot of ways, that starts to build these connections with people and you learn more about who they are. And it has nothing to do with a sexual dynamic. It has everything to do with people are people. And the only way you can really build connection through intimacy is by really having, I think, a solid foundation in many ways, especially if it's going to be about the care ethic that can often be involved in the intersection of more experienced and less experienced. And just so everyone knows, the question I always start with in that game is who was the United States president the year that you were born? Now I modify that and if I'm in like different countries, but and then I answer and then other people have to answer. And no one ever knows when I was born because the person that was president, it's so far back and it was one term and no one remembers him. So it actually benefits me all the time because it doesn't really help other people. And usually their answers definitely give you like more information. And so that's just one way. But yeah, that ultimately, I don't think should have fallen on you, Mary Jane, or anyone else. Like as the person coming in with less experience in the situation, it really shouldn't fall on you to like out all this about yourself, right? It should really, I think, I don't like that word, but it's helpful, recommended when it comes from the person who has the more experience to have conversation around it, maybe after it's invited in some way. I hope that was helpful. And I appreciate you sharing that.
So, Dr. Maki, you mentioned Tantra. For the listeners who are wondering, what in the world is that? Can you please
Yeah.
can you please
Yeah.
elaborate?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And actually, I will even cue this for everyone because you can share this, listeners can check it out. So, because of the intersectionality in that dynamic, quite some many moons ago now, we were both practicing from more of this Buddhist positionality as people. And Tantra, although not an inherent Buddhist practice, it does go back to very old practices that focus on exchanging energy with each other. And it really started in what we now think of as India. And it started in the middle of the first millennium CE, or the Common or Current Era. And if people are interested in like resources, because it really is, it's actually the Kama Sutra, where it's derived from, is the oldest living text that includes like basically sexual health practices in the world, like written down, preserved, and it has images. And unfortunately, Tantra and Kama Sutra in the waves of westernization has kind of become this, it's just poses, right? It's just yogic postures, but that's not what this is. I mean, sure, you can do that, but I think it's really helpful to not appropriate a practice that really is tied in many ways to the belief in spiritual connection and growth within practitioners where it's derived from. And so I would let people know, like, read the Kama Sutra, the Anagaranga is great. And what you basically start with is just shared meditation, shared breath, shared heart sutras, looking into each other's eyes, just touch. It's really just this way of connecting first. And it's meant to be this way of having a shared spiritual connection with each other. It's the belief that ultimately, like, sexual health and sexual encounters are about spirituality. And that's the ultimate part that they play. Having said that, people can take parts of that and be just more Tantra informed. And so in the West, the most common way I've seen this, and I've written about it, and I can share it with you. The most common way it shows up is a practice called sensei focus, which sometimes therapists and counselors will recommend. It's a frequent recommendation in sex therapy for couples and multi-partner dynamics. But it really, sensei is rooted in Tantra. And when Masters and Johnsons, came up with that in the 60s, they never acknowledged that overlap. They didn't cite their source, so to say. And that again is a form of appropriation. And so I really try to make clear, like, I invite people to develop a relationship with Tantra, but just make sure you're doing it in more of an application way and not like just appropriating it and forgetting all these important parts of what it has been and what it really still is in the root place where it originated on the globe.
So, tied to the power dynamic is that myth that being the guide means you're detached, that you can't catch feelings. In our previous episode with Dr. Amanda Morgan about late bloomers, we spoke about how some virgins keep their virginity a secret because they feared being preyed on, like the experienced folk were some hunters out for blood with no emotions tied to it. Is there a truth to that perception?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, that episode was fantastic. And you and Dr. Morgan's conversation and her, incredible wealth of knowledge, just her humorous, amazing, meaningful way of delivering the information was just fantastic. And I remember as I heard that, just reflecting on it, right? And I think that might be, and I don't want to speak for you and your listeners, but that might be why sometimes people who have not had experience or a sexual debut, maybe outside of themselves or even just with themselves, when they are with a partner, they don't out that, so to say. It's almost like a closet, to borrow back to queer experience because of the fear of, is this person only interested in me because of this one part of who I am? Right. And that's it. And will there be feelings because there's already this inexperience and this, kind of related power dynamic? So, yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I do think, however, though, the person who does have experience absolutely can have feelings, right? That can absolutely happen. Ultimately, beyond just like that feeling of like whether or not it's as we've talked about, not all first encounters need to be love per se, whatever that means, even in the most whatever it means. But what we would hope is the feelings would be feelings of consensual, sexual health principles, like we've talked about, pleasure, safety, freedom from exploitation and harm, which is really, honesty, consent, which is built in already in this dynamic. There's this inherent potentiality for exploitation and harm, right? And that's why I think those true focusing on like what kind of feelings are we talking about is important. And they really need to include those sexual health dynamics, whether that's love or not. But some of that is having that honest conversation. And again, a lot of this can't come from the person who has the less experience because there is this fear that that's what's going to happen. And so that's why it's important if you are the person who kind of, I mean, I feel like this is going to sound crazy, but I kind of feel like I get a little targeted sometimes by people with less experience. And so that's why if I read the room, I start to interact in a way that lets that person know, like, hey, I read what's happening here in some way potentially, and let's talk about this in this way. Okay, so you can have more of a sense of who I am and where I'm coming from, and then you can make choices because now you know I have years of experience just in the very nature of existence. And then that's even before you add in the fact that literally I teach sex education and do, this work for a living. And so, right, those are all inherent dynamics. So yeah, I wish there was a way that that would not happen because no one should, be preyed upon unless that's some sort of kink BDSM thing and all parties are consensual and that's what they agree to. And that's kind of beyond the scope of this part.
I hope that sex therapists are not being preyed on so that people can learn more, being used as a
It
tool
Right?
gain
I
more experience.
know. I know. I mean, there's not necessarily research on that, but there's research on perceptions of like sexologists and sex educators. And the perceptions are that we, have more sex, like more whatever this means, crazy sex or something like that. But the research actually shows that we tend to have less sexual partners, have more measured, sexually healthy, fully consent. Like there's so many things that have to apply and like work because if you know a lot about this, it makes you very, nope, this has to be this way. And that's I guess the danger in having so much knowledge.
Dr. Maki, what advice would you give to people who are in the role of guiding the virgin? For instance, maybe there's some newlyweds listening and one of the partners is inexperienced or is a virgin. How can the experienced partner balance care, consent, and pressure without feeling like it's all on their shoulders?
I think it's important to remember that, and we've talked about this, no matter who you are, the first encounter you have with each other, it's gonna come with some awkwardness, right? So I think just being human first, having a bit of just natural understanding that no one's gonna know exactly what they're doing anytime. However, I do think it's important to talk about the care ethics, right? Have these conversations around some of the inherent power differential, whether it's age related or not, because I think that definitely creates the pressure is like, do we talk about it? Do we not talk about it? How do we talk about it? And I know there's been no guide. So I would say just making sure to focus on the health principles, focusing on each other, what makes sense. I mean, I'm biased. I actually think Tantra informed practices are really helpful. So again, happy to share that resource. And I will say this, newlyweds that are kind of more your het cis folks, here's where you could borrow from queer community. And what I mean by that is actually it's way more common, what little research there is, it's way more common to have a more experienced partner and a less experienced partner in queer community, particularly in gay men communities, and especially age gaps. And I think it's because there's just, kind of less education and role model to begin with. And so there's this inherent community almost built in where it's like, oh, yeah, I'm going to learn from someone that has more experience and they are going to care for me and I'm going to have a community. And I really wish in many ways that we could see more of that in those dynamics, regardless of who your partners are, how many partners are, where the body parts are going, right? Because I think some of it is we just need to have a higher care ethic as, communities and as people. And I do want to note that my colleagues and I that have been doing this work that looks at some of these dynamics around experience and gaps there, just to highlight it, we presented at the Society for Scientific Study of Sexuality in November of 24. It was me and Ashley Haynes Gibson and Courtney Stern Spalding and then Starla Anastasio. And you can find that on the Quietus site if anybody wants access to that too. That's great. But there's just as little information out there. And that's why I think podcasts like this one are so important. And I just am humbled every time that I get a chance to talk with you and get a chance to put it out there to the listeners in the multiverse. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It feels like a full circle because this is the final episode for season 1. And we started the first episode with you. And now we're closing with you. So honestly, it just feels right.
Oh, that's amazing. Yay. First
Yeah.
and last.
Yes, yes. For season 1. And then, of course, we're going to have
Exactly.
more conversations in season 2.
I can't
Yeah.
wait. I can't wait.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So thank you so much for your wisdom, your compassion, your openness. It's such a gift, not only for me, but also for every listener who's been on this journey with us. You've helped us challenge myths, lean into our curiosity, and remember that our sexual stories are always valid, no matter how awkward, tender, or messy they may be. It's an honor to share this space with you, and I couldn't imagine wrapping season 1 any other way. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
You might have noticed we switched up on the sound now. That's because we're giving you a sneak peek of what's coming in season 2. New stories, new themes, and a whole new vibe. The music you're hearing is by Funk, the Poetic Piper, setting the tone for what's ahead. Huge shout out to Funk for letting us bring his beats into season 2 of Sexual Encounters the very first time. You heard it here first. Next season, we're diving into the bold, the taboo, and the tangled, where boundaries blur, bodies explore, and confessions surface. Think Mile High Club, digital sex, tied up sex, sex for pay, and so much more. Got a story to tell? We'd love to hear it. DM us at Let's Talk First, email sexualencounterstheveryfirst@gmail.com, or share anonymously at bit.ly/Let's Talk First. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single story. You're listening to Sexual Encounters, the very first time.